She stood in his dusty workshop, handing him divorce papers with a cruel smile. Her arrogant family laughed, calling him a worthless paint scraper who was holding her back. They thought they had finally won. But as the quiet man wiped the dirt from his calloused hands and calmly read the legal documents, none of them knew the terrifying truth. He wasn't just a poor artist. He secretly owned the €9 billion empire that paid her salary. Make sure to stick around until the very end to see exactly how this incredible twist unfolds. But before we dive into the story, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from today. I absolutely love seeing where all of my viewers are tuning in from around the world. Now, let's get into the story. There is a specific, profound silence that exists only inside a room where time is being carefully reversed. In his studio, nestled in the cobblestone heart of the city's historic district, Arthur Vance sat immersed in that silence. The air was heavy with the sharp, honest scent of turpentine, aged linseed oil, and the dry dust of history. Under the concentrated glow of a single halogen lamp, he held a cotton swab no larger than a match head, working it with agonizingly slow, deliberate circular motions across the surface of a 17th century Dutch landscape. He was removing 300 years of accumulated grime, hearth smoke, and yellowed varnish. With every microscopic rotation of his wrist, a sliver of dull brown gave way to a brilliant, piercing lapis lazuli blue. To the outside world, this was tedious, invisible labor. To Arthur, it was the only work that mattered. It was a physical manifestation of his deepest conviction. That true, enduring value is almost always hidden beneath layers of neglect, waiting for someone with the patience to reveal it. Patience was not merely a virtue to Arthur. It was his native language. We live in an era that worships the immediate, a society addicted to the loud, the sudden, and the superficial. Men of Arthur's age were expected to be making noise in corner offices, projecting authority, and demanding attention. But Arthur measured his life not in quarterly earnings or fleeting trends, but in the slow, undeniable permanence of heritage. He understood that anything built overnight could be dismantled just as quickly. The canvas in front of him had survived wars, revolutions, and the collapse of empires because its foundation was masterful. People walked past his modest storefront every day, glancing through the glass of the man in the stained canvas apron, seeing nothing more than a quiet artisan fading into margins of a modern, fast-paced city. They did not know, and he would never be so vulgar as to tell them, that the man carefully wiping away centuries of dirt was the sole principal and architect of the Vance Heritage Group. They did not know that the quiet restorer in the dusty apron controlled a $9 billion global empire. His holdings dictated the movements of the international art market. He owned the premier auction houses in London, Geneva, and New York. His real estate portfolio did not consist of cheap, glass-paneled skyscrapers, but of iconic, centuries-old properties. Castles in the Loire Valley, historic manors in the English countryside, and the very cultural preservation trust that governed the city's heritage. The current private valuation of his life's work sat quietly at $9 billion. He owned the very street his small shop sat on. He owned the buildings casting shadows over it. Yet, every morning at 6 o'clock, Arthur came to this room, tied the worn apron around his waist, and sat at his easel. He did this because he possessed a rare, terrifying understanding of what abstract wealth does to human soul. Money, in those staggering quantities, ceases to be real. It becomes numbers on a screen, a phantom force that insulates a man from the consequences of the physical world, breeding arrogance and severing his connection to honest labor. Arthur refused to become a ghost in his own life. The restoration studio was his anchor, the weight of the wooden frame, the chemical burn of the solvent, the stubborn resistance of old paint. These were tactile, undeniable truths. They kept his hands calloused and his ego entirely tethered to reality. He did not need the world to look at him and see a titan of industry. He only needed to look at himself in the mirror and see a man who still knew how to work. In a society where wealthy men purchase visibility to prove they exist, Arthur had spent 3 decades purchasing invisibility. It was a deliberate, sophisticated choice. He had watched the relentless pursuit of status ruin brilliant minds, reducing them to insecure performers desperately seeking applause. Arthur required no applause. His dignity was internal, absolute and utterly silent. And as he set aside his swab, inspecting the newly freed patch of vibrant blue paint, he felt a profound, solitary satisfaction of a man entirely at peace with who was, regardless of who the world assumed him to be. 5 miles away from the quiet, honest scent of turpentine, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a sharp, ringing sound of crystal glasses and the relentless, exhausting hum of transactional ambition. Eleanor had just been named the executive director of the Wellington National Gallery. It was a crown she had relentlessly pursued for 8 years, a position of immense cultural influence and undeniable social power. To celebrate, her family had gathered in the private dining room of a restaurant where the menus lacked prices, and the patrons spoke just loudly enough to ensure their importance was registered by the neighboring tables. This was the world of the Caldwell family, a world where human worth was a volatile currency, and every relationship was a performance carefully curated for an audience of their peers. At the head of the table sat Beatrice, Eleanor's mother. Beatrice was a woman whose social aspirations were as rigidly structured as her posture, someone who judged the value of a room the moment she entered it, instinctively calculating who was of use and who was strictly invisible. Beside her sat Julian, Eleanor's younger brother, a slick wealth manager who equated his own aggressive, commission-based urgency with genuine authority. Julian wore his bespoke suits like a weapon. To Julian, ambition was a volume dial, and anyone who wasn't shouting was simply failing. And the most glaring failure in their lives, the perpetual insult to the family's collective pride, was a man conspicuously absent from the celebratory dinner, Arthur. He is, quite frankly, a glorified window washer for old paintings, Julian remarked, swirling his scotch, delivering the phrase with the practiced ease of a joke he had told 100 times. I still don't understand how a woman who now runs the Wellington is going home to a man whose hands look like a day laborer's. Beatrice offered a thin, aristocratic smile, taking a slow sip of her wine. He simply lacks a ceiling, darling, she murmured, her voice dripping with that specific, lethal brand of maternal pity. He has no upward trajectory. A man who is entirely content to scrape dirt off other people's achievements will never build anything of his own. It was a family consensus, an agreed-upon reality that Arthur was a stagnant pool in the rushing river of their collective success. Eleanor sat at the center of their adulation, absorbing their verdict not with a wife's defense, but with a quiet, tragic complicity. It had not always been this way. When she first met Arthur 3 years ago, his stillness had captivated her. In a society of men endlessly performing their own importance, Arthur had possessed a profound, grounded gravity. She had found his quietness deeply romantic, viewing it as a sanctuary from her mother's relentless judgments and her brother's exhausting metrics. But a marriage is a long, vulnerable conversation, and over time, the Caldwell family had continuously, methodically spoken over Arthur's silence. The sustained, daily pressure of their condescension had acted like a slow-drip acid on her affection. Under Beatrice's constant scrutiny and Julian's sneering remarks, Eleanor's own internal compass had warped. She had slowly lost the ability to read her husband accurately. She no longer saw his deep, unshakable peace. She only saw a lack of motion. She had fatally mistaken his refusal to compete in a superficial game as an inability to play at all. Now, bathed in the glow of her massive promotion, the cognitive dissonance was too great to ignore. She was ascending to the very peak of the city's elite cultural hierarchy. She convinced herself she had outgrown the dusty man in the apron, and as she accepted another toast, she resolved to sever the anchor before it could drag her beneath the surface of her own rising tide. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the studio was wrapped in particular amber-toned silence that settles over a room when serious, meticulous work is being done. Arthur was seated at his primary bench, blending a pinpoint drop of raw umber pigment into a shallow pool of mastic varnish. The rhythm of his breathing was perfectly synchronized with the delicate, deliberate strokes of his sable brush. For Arthur, the studio at this hour was an absolute sanctuary, a rare space where the relentless friction of the modern world was entirely filtered out by thick brick walls and the absorbing, solemn presence of history. Motes of dust drifted lazily through a single shaft of late-afternoon sunlight, suspended in an environment that felt blissfully insulated from the crude theater of human ambition. Then the sanctuary was breached. The intrusion did not begin with a spoken word, but with a sound entirely alien to the carefully calibrated acoustics of the space. It was a sharp, aggressive strike of a designer stiletto heel against the original, hand-laid hardwood of the entryway. In a room tuned to the soft scrape of palette knives and the hushed friction of canvas, the rapid, staccato rhythm of that footwear cut through the air like a physical violation. Arthur did not flinch, nor did he immediately turn around. He finished his stroke with absolute, unhurried precision, wiped the ferrule of his brush on a piece of clean linen, and only then lifted his gaze. Eleanor stood just inside the threshold. She was dressed in a striking, immaculate ivory suit that radiated the pristine, untouchable energy of a newly minted executive preparing to conquer a boardroom. But the true disruption to the room was not her attire. It was the entourage that followed her through the heavy wooden door. Flanking her were Beatrice and Julian, with her father, Richard, trailing a half-step behind, a man whose permanent, comfortable silence was built entirely upon a cowardly complicity with his wife's cruelties. The visual collision between these two colliding worlds was profoundly jarring. Here, amidst half-restored wooden frames, glass jars of raw pigment, cracked leather bindings, and a heavy, honest scent of linseed oil, stood for individuals armored in expensive, rigid tailoring. They looked exceptionally out of place, exuding the nervous, disdainful energy of royalty forced to inspect a scullery. Beatrice's reaction to the environment was immediate and entirely unmasked. She paused just inside the door, her eyes scanning the scarred floorboards, the stained aprons hanging on iron hooks, and the cluttered antique workbenches. She let out a soft, audible exhale of revulsion, a practiced, theatrical sneer designed to communicate that the very air in the room was unfit for her lungs. Julian stood beside her, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke navy blazer, a faint, predatory smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked around the shop not with curiosity, but with a specific, arrogant appraisal of a wealth manager calculating just how little a man's life amounted to. They did not step forward to offer a greeting. Instead, they moved with a deliberate, choreographed cruelty. Eleanor stepped directly into the center of the room, while Beatrice, Julian, and Richard fanned out slightly behind her, forming a shallow semicircle. It was an arrangement Arthur recognized instantly. It was a physical blocking of a theatrical audience. They had not come merely to support Eleanor. They had come to spectate. They had dressed in their finest clothes and marched into a sanctuary to witness a performance of humiliation. They wanted to savor the exact moment the stagnant, dusty restorer realized he was being discarded by a woman ascending to the heights of society. Arthur looked at the four of them standing in his quiet shop. He felt no rising panic, no flush of anger, only a profound, clinical stillness, waiting to see exactly how the scene they had written for him was meant to play out. Eleanor closed the final few feet between them, breaking the invisible barrier that separated the quiet, honest labor of the studio from the theatrical cruelty of her arrival. In her impeccably manicured hands, she carried a sleek, black leather portfolio. It was the kind of object designed for executive boardrooms, a vessel for aggressive corporate takeovers and decisive financial restructuring. To bring it here, into a room that smelled of raw earth, aged wood, and history, was a calculated insult. She extended her arm, holding the leather-bound folder out to him like a formal summons. When she spoke, her voice possessed a flat, rehearsed cadence of a woman who had practiced her lines in front of a mirror until all the messy, human emotion had been polished away. She did not speak to him as a wife ending a marriage. She spoke to him as a senior director terminating an underperforming employee. "I need you to sign these, Arthur," she said, the words clipping the quiet air. "We have reached a point where our trajectories simply no longer align. You have to understand, with the gallery, with my new position, I am entering a sphere that requires a partner who can stand beside me on that level, a partner who understands the demands of that status." She paused, perhaps waiting for a flicker of devastation, but when none came, she pressed on, delivering the fatal, rehearsed blow. "I have outgrown this life, Arthur. I have outgrown us. I need to move forward without being anchored to a man who refuses to evolve." Behind her, Beatrice let out a sharp, audible bark of laughter. It was a terrible, echoing sound in the solemn space of the studio, the laugh of a victor stepping on the neck of the vanquished. "Oh, finally," the older woman muttered, waving a hand dismissively at the room. Julian simply adjusted his stance, his smirk widening into a look of supreme, self-satisfied amusement. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were eagerly anticipating the flush of humiliation, the stammering pleas, or perhaps a pathetic outburst of working-class rage that they could categorize as uncouth and thereby instantly validate their cruelty. Instead, they were met with a phenomenon none of them possessed the depth to comprehend: absolute, sovereign stillness. Arthur did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the mocking faces of his in-laws, nor did he seek pity in the eyes of his wife. He simply looked at the leather portfolio, moving with the unhurried grace of a man who dictates his own timeline. Arthur reached out and took the folder. He did not open it immediately. First, he turned back to his heavy oak workbench. He carefully screwed the brass cap onto his jar of solvent, ensuring the seal was completely tight. He picked up a clean linen cloth and meticulously wiped the residue of raw umber and linseed oil from his calloused fingers. Finally, he reached into the breast pocket of his apron, retrieved his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and slipped them on. Only then did he open the portfolio. He began to read the divorce decree, and he read it not with the frantic, tear-filled panic of a discarded husband, but with the exact, surgical scrutiny he applied to a 17th-century masterpiece. He read every single page. He examined the asset divisions, the liability waivers, the boilerplate clauses, and the legal vernacular, his eyes tracking line by line. He did not rush. He did not skim the paragraphs to find the signature line. The silence in the room stretched from a few seconds into an excruciating minute, and then 2, and then 3. The Caldwell family had prepared for a swift, dramatic confrontation, but they had not prepared for a comprehensive, silent interrogation of the text. As Arthur stood there, calmly absorbing the legal architecture of their separation, the smug anticipation of the family began to curdle into a strange, creeping discomfort. The man they had come to humiliate was suddenly the only person in the room holding all the gravity. 4 minutes is an eternity to people who measure their lives in sound bites and instant gratification. As Arthur continued to read, the oxygen in the restoration studio seemed to steadily thin. The Caldwell family had arrived expecting a brief, satisfying drama, a swift surrender. Instead, they were subjected to the unbearable weight of a man who refused to be rushed. By the 3rd minute, Beatrice shifted her weight, the leather strap of her handbag creaking loudly in the quiet room. By the 4th minute, Julian's smug grin had dissolved into a tight, irritated grimace. He pulled out his phone, attempting to project boredom, but the nervous tapping of his thumb betrayed him. Eleanor stood frozen, her outstretched hand having fallen back to her side, watching a man she thought she had outgrown command the absolute center of gravity without moving a single muscle. When Arthur finally reached the last page, he did not sigh, he did not shake his head, or look up with wounded eyes. He simply aligned the edges of the thick paper with the meticulous care of an archivist handling a fragile manuscript, closed the leather portfolio, and removed his reading glasses. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly level, carrying the calm, diagnostic authority of a master appraiser identifying a clumsy forgery. "Your counsel is efficient," Arthur said, the steady baritone of his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "The asset division is standard, and the waivers regarding your future earnings of the gallery are adequately framed. However, the document contains fundamental flaws in its legal provenance." He held the portfolio out. Eleanor took it automatically, her pristine confidence visibly faltering under his unwavering gaze. "The primary marital domicile is incorrectly listed. More critically, the jurisdictional clauses regarding the separation of blind cultural trusts are entirely mishandled. If filed in this state, the entire petition will be rejected by a chancery judge in preliminary review." Eleanor stared at him, the heavy, sophisticated legal vernacular completely at odds with the man she believed she knew. Before she could process the anomaly, Arthur continued, "Have your lawyer contact my attorney to amend the filings. Elias Thorne. You will find his offices in the Sovereign Building, 48th floor." The name hung in the heavy, turpentine-laced air. For a fraction of a second, Julian's eyes widened. As an aggressive wealth manager, he knew the Sovereign Building, and he certainly knew the terrifying caliber of law practiced on its upper floors. But the cognitive dissonance was too vast for his arrogant mind to bridge. Julian let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, pointing a manicured finger at Arthur's stained apron. Elias Thorne, are you out of your mind? A glorified paint scraper with a Tier 1 corporate litigator on retainer? What? Did you find one of his discarded business cards on the subway? Beatrice stepped forward, her patience utterly exhausted by what she perceived as a pathetic, desperate bluff. Stop this absurd theater, Arthur. Sign the paper so my daughter can leave this filthy room and get back to her actual life. Arthur looked at Beatrice, then at Julian, and finally at his wife. He possessed 1,000 devastating truths he could have unleashed in that moment, but he understood a fundamental rule of human engagement. To defend oneself to the committedly ignorant is to surrender one's dignity. So he gave them nothing. Have the corrections made, Eleanor, Arthur said quietly, turning his back to the four of them. Once the document is mathematically and legally accurate, I will sign it. I have no desire to delay your ascension. He picked up his sable brush, dipped it into the mastic varnish, and leaned back over his 17th century canvas. He did not speak another word. Behind him, the Caldwell family stood in profound, humiliating silence of scene that is spectacularly misfired. No voices were raised, no tears were shed. Yet as Eleanor turned and led her family out of the studio, the rapid clicking of their shoes on the floorboards did not sound like a victorious march. It sounded exactly like a retreat. The Wellington National Gallery was not merely a building. It was an institution carved into the very skyline of the city, a temple of limestone and ambition that had defined the cultural landscape for over a century. Walking to the grand concourse on that first Monday morning, Eleanor felt the immense, cooling weight of the architecture settling around her like an elegant shroud. The air smelled of polished marble, expensive floor wax, and the hushed, reverent stillness of a space that demanded to be taken seriously. This was the air she had been holding her breath to inhale for 8 years. With every step toward the executive wing, the memory of the previous Thursday, the dust of the studio, the smell of turpentine, the lingering, quiet gaze of a man she now considered a relic of a smaller life, faded into a distant, inconsequential murmur. She felt a profound, exhilarating sense of liberation. It was a specific, intoxicating buoyancy of a woman who has finally cut the anchor chain. For 3 years, she had carried the perceived limitations of her marriage like a heavy, ill-fitting coat, constantly adjusting herself to the silent judgment of a husband who seemingly had no interest in the heights she intended to scale. Now, that coat was discarded. She was no longer defined by the associations of a stagnant man. She was defined by the authority of her own credentials, the sharpness of her strategy, and the sheer, undeniable reality of the position she held. She was the executive director of the Wellington. She had arrived. Her office was a panoramic sanctuary on the 4th floor, overlooking the sculpture garden and the sprawling, manicured grounds that served as the gallery's public face. The assistant, a sharp, precise woman named Sarah, had already arranged the desk with an efficiency that bordered on military precision. A leather-bound agenda rested near the center, detailing the morning's welcome meeting with the executive board. Eleanor walked to floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city below, feeling the absolute, serene confidence of a professional who knows they are exactly where they deserve to be. She watched the pedestrians moving along the sidewalks, oblivious of the power shifting in the suite behind them, and felt a rush of genuine, unperformed joy. The morning proceeded with the smooth, rhythmic elegance of a well-oiled machine. There were handshakes that carried the weight of institutional endorsement, conversations about donor acquisitions, and exhilarating, high-stakes language of global cultural administration. She moved through the hallways with a posture that had been honed by years of anticipation, answering questions with a crispness that silenced any lingering doubts about her readiness for the role. Every interaction, every approval, every acknowledgement of her status was a brick in the monument she was building to herself. She sat at the head of the conference table for the board welcome meeting, a document detailing the quarterly fiscal projections sitting in front of her. She felt like a conductor stepping onto a podium before a world-class orchestra. The Wellington was a massive, complex organism, and she was its new, steady heart. She was completely, utterly immersed in the thrill of the ascent, her mind occupied with the strategy of the next decade, never once stopping to consider the structural reality beneath her feet. She was standing on marble floors, walking through vaulted galleries, and directing operations within a massive, historic footprint, entirely unaware that the foundation of the very institution she now commanded was inextricably, silently owned by the man she had just left behind in a dusty, turpentine-soaked room. She was a director, the leader, the master of the house, enjoying the victory of a lifetime, while the true master of the house was, at that very moment, probably running a cotton swab over a painting, perfectly content to let her have the illusion of the win. The afterglow of flawless professional triumph is a fragile atmosphere, easily punctured by the intrusion of uninvited reality. At 2:15 that afternoon, Eleanor sat behind a massive slab of polished mahogany that served as her new desk, reviewing a series of high-level acquisition proposals. The silence in her office was expensive, completely insulated by double-paned acoustic glass that kept the noise of the city safely at bay. When her personal cell phone violently buzzed against the wood, the sound was jarringly loud. The caller ID displayed the name of her divorce attorney, Diane Sterling. Diane was a woman whose professional reputation was built on ruthless, unshakable confidence, a litigator who navigated high-net-worth marital separations with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a great white shark. But when Eleanor answered the call, the voice on the other end of the line was entirely stripped of its usual predatory bravado. It was tight, hushed, and vibrating with an unfamiliar, deeply unsettling panic. Diane did not offer a customary greeting. She simply asked, her tone pitched artificially low, if Eleanor was alone in the room, and if the office door was completely closed. When Eleanor confirmed that it was, the attorney exhaled a shaky breath that sounded uncomfortably loud in the receiver. She asked Eleanor to repeat the name of the lawyer Arthur had mentioned the previous afternoon in the restoration studio. Eleanor, feeling a sudden inexplicable tightening in her chest, repeated the name slowly, Elias Thorne. Diane's voice dropped another octave as she carefully laid out the horrifying reality of that name. She had spent the last 2 hours conducting what she assumed would be a routine background check on opposing counsel. What she found had entirely dismantled her understanding of the case, leaving her legally and professionally paralyzed. Elias Thorne was not a small-town litigator, nor was he a storefront attorney who handled blue-collar disputes or standard domestic grievances. He was a senior managing partner of a firm that specialized exclusively in global wealth preservation, blind cultural trusts, and international corporate defense. His minimum annual retainer was an 8-figure sum. He represented sovereign wealth funds, legacy institutions, and multinational conglomerates. As Diane plainly, breathlessly stated, a man like Elias Thorne did not take walk-ins. He did not advertise, and he most certainly did not represent men who scraped dirt off old canvases for an hourly wage. Eleanor stood up from her heavy leather chair, walking slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked out at the sprawling, manicured grounds of the Wellington, but the vibrant green lawn suddenly seemed entirely out of focus. She tried to force a laugh, a weak, desperate echo of her brother Julian's arrogant dismissal from the day before, suggesting there must simply be a mistake, a mix-up in the state registry. Diane silenced her immediately. There was no mistake. Thorne's office had already made contact. They had reached out with a terrifying, devastatingly polite efficiency, confirming the representation and legally verifying the jurisdictional errors Arthur had so casually pointed out. But they had not merely sent a minor clerical correction. They had transmitted a supplementary asset disclosure, a heavily encrypted, password-protected file that was currently sitting in Diane's secure inbox. The attorney explained that she had just forwarded the secure file to Eleanor's private email, but she issued a chilling, unprecedented directive before ending the call. Diane told her client, with absolute, unwavering sincerity, to physically sit down before opening the document. She warned Eleanor to prepare herself for a reality that neither of them had the appropriate instruments to measure. The line went dead. Eleanor stood perfectly still in the center of her pristine, sunlit office. A soft, electronic chime emanated from her computer monitor, signaling the arrival of the encrypted file. The climate-controlled air in the executive suite suddenly felt impossibly thin, suffocatingly tight, as the cold, terrifying shadow of profound, unimaginable error began to stretch across the marble floor beneath her feet. Eleanor moved back to the desk, her legs feeling strangely disconnected from the rest of her body. The mouse clicked with a hollow, plastic finality as she entered the decryption key Diane had provided. The document that loaded onto the screen was not a standard legal filing. It was a financial architecture of staggering, incomprehensible scale. The header was clean, minimalist, and stripped of any desperate branding. Vance Heritage Group. Supplementary asset disclosure. She scrolled down to the first page. The text was dense but unmistakably clear. It outlined a network of international holdings that read like the manifest of a sovereign nation. There were premier auction houses in Geneva, Paris, and London. There were vast tracts of historic real estate spanning the European continent, from 17th century chateaus to entire blocks of heritage-protected commercial districts in major capitals. At the bottom of the second page, listed with a quiet, terrifying understatement of true wealth, was the current private valuation, 9 billion euros. Eleanor stopped breathing. The number was so large it momentarily short-circuited her brain's ability to process it. 9 billion euros. She scrolled back to the top of the document, her eyes desperately scanning for a board of directors, a consortium of investors, or a parent conglomerate. There was nothing. There was only a single, isolated line under the ownership structure. Principal and sole owner, Arthur Vance. The man with the stained canvas apron. The man she had left standing in a turpentine center room less than 24 hours ago, calmly reading legal papers while her mother laughed at him. But the true, world-shattering devastation was waiting on the third page. It was a detailed breakdown of the Cultural Preservation Trust, funded entirely by the Vance Heritage Group. Eleanor's eyes drifted down the alphabetical list of institutions heavily endowed by the trust. And then time simply stopped. There it was, the Wellington National Gallery. It was not merely a recipient of occasional charity. The trust held a foundational lease on the historic property, supplied over 70% of the annual operating budget, and fully funded the executive endowment. The silence in her corner office was no longer an expensive luxury. It was a vacuum, sucking the life out of her. The marble floors, the vaulted ceilings, the panoramic windows, and the very desk she was sitting at, all of it belonged to Arthur. She had spent the morning reveling in her supremacy, believing she had finally escaped the shadow of a stagnant, unambitious man, only to discover that he owned the sun, the sky, and the ground she stood on. A sickening wave of memory crashed over her. She heard Julian's arrogant voice echoing in her mind, mocking the glorified window washer. She heard her mother's cruel, aristocratic laugh, dismissing Arthur as a man without a ceiling. She remembered her own complacent silence, the way she looked down at his rough, callous hands that she believed were incapable of building a future. Those hands had built the 9 billion euro empire that was currently paying her salary. He had sat through 3 years of agonizing family dinners. He had absorbed every sneer, every insult, every condescending remark about his lack of ambition, and he had never said a word. He had let them perform their small, fragile superiority while he held the entire board. The reality of his invisible empire crushed her entire worldview into dust. The promotion she had fought so hard for, the prestigious title she wore like a crown, suddenly felt like a hollow, pathetic joke. She pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a sob that was threatening to tear its way out of her chest. The grand, triumphant narrative she had written for herself was a lie. She had not outgrown him. She had never even comprehended his actual size. Eleanor's fingers were shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen of her phone. The sleek, heavy device felt like a foreign object in her hand, suddenly carrying the weight of a staggering, undeniable truth. She pressed Arthur's name, holding the phone to her ear as she stared blindly at the stunning, panoramic vista of the city below. The line rang twice. When he answered, there was no hostility in his greeting, only the familiar, steady baritone accompanied by the faint, rhythmic sound of a bristle brush against canvas. It was the sound of a man perfectly anchored to the earth, a sound she had spent 3 years misinterpreting as failure. The power dynamic in their marriage, which she had so confidently believed she commanded from a great height, had inverted with terrifying, absolute force. She was merely a guest in a universe he had quietly, methodically constructed. 9 billion euros, she whispered, her voice cracking, entirely stripped of its executive polish. You own the trust. You own the Wellington. Arthur did not pause his work immediately. She could hear the soft, deliberate friction of his brush. "The valuation is accurate as of the last fiscal quarter," he replied, his tone devoid of any petty triumph or malice. "And the trust hold the foundational lease, yes." Eleanor closed her eyes, a hot tear slipping down her pristine cheek. "Why, Arthur? Why would you let me believe? Why would you sit at our dinner table, week after week, letting my mother insult you, letting Julian laugh at you? Why didn't you just tell me?" The brushstrokes finally ceased. The silence on his end of the line was the deep, measured quiet of a man who had waited years to have this exact conversation. "Because immense wealth is a distortion, Eleanor," he said softly, the gravity of his words settling over the line. "It is a force that warps the shape of every room it enters. When people know what you possess, they stop reacting to you and start reacting to the capital. They perform. I spend my life stripping away centuries of gilded varnish to find the authentic, honest layers underneath. I needed my marriage to be built on the bare canvas. I needed to know who you were and how you would love me when you believed I had absolutely nothing to offer you but my character." Eleanor leaned heavily against the chilled glass of her window, the cold pain biting into her forehead. "And the gallery?" she choked out, her pride shattering. "My promotion? Is this just pity? Did you buy me a corner office so I could play pretend?" "No," Arthur said, a sudden sharpness in his voice cutting through her panic. "That I want you to hear very clearly, and you must believe it. The trust operates entirely blind. I do not interfere with the Wellington's operational board. You earned that position, Eleanor. You earned it through your own brilliance, your impeccable strategy, and your grueling work. That office is yours. The title is entirely yours." She let out a fractured, trembling breath. A tiny measure of relief washed over her, but was immediately swallowed by a profound, crushing sorrow. "Then what went wrong with us?" she asked, her vulnerability echoing in the empty, expensive room. Arthur's sigh was a gentle, heavy sound. "When we first met, you had a brilliant, accurate intuition. You saw me for who I was, and you valued the quiet. But over time, you stopped trusting your own eyes. You allowed your mother and your brother to recalibrate your moral compass. You let their shallow, noisy metrics dictate the value of our life together. You looked at my calloused hands, and instead of seeing a man who built things to last, you let them convince you I was a man who had simply stopped trying. The foundation of our marriage was always solid, Eleanor, but you chose to listen to critics in the gallery rather than trust the artist who painted the canvas." The streetlights of the historic district cast long, amber shadows across the cobblestones as Eleanor approached the studio for the second time that week. The city was settling into its evening rhythm, the frantic urgency of the business day fading into a hushed, reflective dusk. When she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the bell above it did not chime with the sharp aggression of her previous visit. Her footsteps, too, were different. She had left the immaculate, intimidating ivory suit at her apartment, and she had abandoned the designer heels. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and flat, soft-soled shoes, crossing the original hardwood floor with a quiet, profound respect for the space she had once allowed her family to desecrate. Arthur was standing near the deep cast-iron sink at the back of the room, meticulously washing the raw pigment from a sable brush with a bar of olive oil soap. He did not look surprised to see her. The leather portfolio, the one containing the divorce papers, rested on the edge of his oak workbench, exactly where she had thrust it at him the day before. The room smelled of aged wood and quiet endurance. Eleanor walked over to the bench, looking down at the legal documents, and then up at the man who owned the very foundation of her world. All the defensive armor she had worn for the past 3 years was completely stripped away, leaving her exposed, deeply humbled, and devastatingly awake. She asked him, her voice barely above a whisper, if there was any way to fix what had been broken between them. She told him she was ready to silence the noise of her family, to step away from their shallow metrics, and to finally be the partner he had hoped she would be. Arthur finished rinsing his brush, dried his callous hands on a linen towel, and walked over to stand beside her. He looked at the half-restored 17th-century landscape resting on his easel. He pointed to a small, dark corner of the painting, a section where the vibrant colors had begun to heavily flake and pull away from the backing. Arthur spoke with a gentle, agonizing clarity. He explained that in the world of restoration, Almost any surface damage can be painstakingly reversed. You can strip away centuries of blackened soot, you can dissolve layers of cheap, yellowed varnish applied by lesser hands, and you can even mend a superficial tear. But, he told her, there comes a point in the appraisal process when you must inspect the back of the piece. If the raw weave of the canvas itself has begun to rot, if the very fibers holding the art together have surrendered to decay, no amount of brilliant paint or masterful technique will save it. To paint over a rotten canvas is just a comfortable lie. The structure will eventually collapse. Eleanor looked at the painting, and the truth of his metaphor settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The trust in their marriage was a canvas. She had not merely let her family apply a bad layer of varnish. She had allowed their constant, cruel judgments to rot the very fibers of her loyalty to him. She had fundamentally compromised the foundation of their relationship. Tears slipped silently down her face as she finally understood that some things, once allowed to decay from the inside out, cannot be restored. Arthur reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. There was no anger left in him, only the bittersweet, profound peace of man who demands the absolute truth. Eleanor reached for the pen resting beside the portfolio, her hand trembling, and signed her name to the corrected documents, ending their marriage not because she had outgrown him, but because she had realized, far too late, the true value of the man she was losing. In a world obsessed with loud ambitions and glittering facades, it is a rare and quiet power to know your own worth without ever needing to announce it. True legacy is never found in the titles we hold or the applause we chase. It is built in the silent, unglamorous moments, resting on a foundation of absolute integrity. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe in the enduring value of patience and quiet strength, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a deeper narrative. We are building a community of thoughtful listeners, and I would love to know where our audience is tuning in from today. So please drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from.